Chapter 5 of The Mystery of Pain. Recording by Ethan D. Gilkey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. These thoughts have been made clearer to my own mind by some others which our common experience has suggested to me. My attention was first drawn to them in this connection while engaged in gardening, and feeling how essential a part of the pleasure which that occupation gave me was furnished by the slight inconveniences which it involved. Without the latter, I felt that the employment would have wanted very much of its zest. The little claim upon the endurance constituted a real part of the charm. As I became conscious of this fact, it was natural to go on to reflect how completely it seems to be the law of nature that, in order to be thoroughly enjoyable, and to continue so, our life must include more or less of willingly accepted inconvenience. This inconvenience may be, in most cases, slight, but still, with some exceptions which I shall refer to presently, it seems to be in all cases necessary. There is inconvenience overcome, endurance accepted, to some extent, in every life that is permanently pleasurable, and this independently of all moral considerations, merely by the nature of our constitution. We see this fact strikingly exhibited in the field of sports, and in every kind of active amusement. It reaches its height, perhaps, in the pleasure found now so widely in ascending mountains, which seems to be a really painful task, but the same element is found almost universally in sports. Look at the roughness and fatigue of cricket, the toil, even pain, of a hearty day's boating. Nay, how much less charm were there even in a picnic, if it were not for its inconveniences and little denials. But these are only special instances of a law that seems to be universal in our experience. Whether it may seem paradoxical or not, it is a fact of our nature that, without endurance, life ceases to be enjoyable. Without pains accepted, pleasure will not be permanent. For the most part, among intelligent persons, this fact is so fully accepted and acted upon that they are hardly conscious how universally it is true. They take their inconveniences, accept their little pains, let us say, for example, the rising at a reasonable hour in spite of sloth, or the free use of cold water in spite of the shock, and reap their reward accordingly in a healthful, pleasurable life. But the law becomes evident immediately in its breach. It asserts itself inevitably against the attempt to avoid it. A life from which everything that has in it the element of pain is banished, becomes a life not worth having, or worse, of an intolerable tedium and disgust. There is ample proof in the experience of the foolish among the rich, that no course is more fatal to pleasure than to succeed in putting aside everything that can call for endurance. The stronger and more generous faculties of our nature, debarred from their true exercise, avenge themselves by poisoning and embittering all that remains. A striking illustration of this fact is given in the words reported to have been uttered by Lord Queensberry as he stood looking at the scene from Richmond Hill. "Oh, what wearisome river! It will keep running, running, and I am so tired of it." Footnote: Mrs. Trench's Memoirs. End footnote. But the records of luxury in all the ages furnish a long succession of similar instances. The whole principle is embodied in the now universally recognized doctrine of that necessity of work, itself an irksome thing, for happiness. This is the thought that occurred to me. In our healthful and natural life, endurance is essential to pleasure. Our enjoyment, by the very construction of our nature, absorbs and takes into itself, as a necessary element, a certain amount of pain. That is, of what would, if it stood by itself, be pain. But when we recognize this fact, we can hardly help remarking another also. The amount of endurance or pain that our pleasure will thus absorb and turn into its own sustenance is not fixed. It varies, being in some cases more, and some less, and especially varies with the intensity and perfectness of the life. A strong and healthy person can absorb into his pleasure a really large amount of what would otherwise be pain, that of the hard day's hunting or rowing, or the ascent of a considerable mountain. Or he will enjoy a great amount of risk as we read in the life of Stephenson, that the navies in his day preferred the most dangerous tasks. A weak person can enjoy much less. Fatigue or discomfort soon spoils his pleasure. But a sick person, one in whom the bodily life is depraved or wanting in its perfectness, can enjoy none. His pleasure can absorb no endurance at all. He must be shielded from all that is painful, from all that taxes, and to the strong man so delightfully taxes, the power to bear. The pains which are the very condition of enjoyment to the healthy man become to him intolerable, utterly unendurable and terrible. He must be laid upon a soft bed, guarded from every shake or jar, from every call upon his powers, from all loud sounds, or brightness even of the light. He can find pleasure only in that which is itself unendurable to the healthy man, the absence of all exertion. For when we go on to consider the facts in this connection, we see that the sick man finds intolerable not only that element in healthy pleasure which demands endurance, and might be regarded as in itself painful, but that every kind of action, speaking generally, is painful to him. The natural exercise of the powers, which is the very source of healthy pleasure, is his agony. The whole feeling is inverted. That which is properly pleasure, and ought to be pleasure to him, is become his torment, and no effect can render it otherwise. Accordingly, in all our dealings with a sick man, and in all his thoughts respecting himself, if he is capable of thinking truly, this inversion of his natural condition is recognized. It is remembered that what is properly pleasurable is painful to him, and that his pleasures are in things that should be to him worse than indifferent. When he is promised perfect enjoyment, he does not look forward to the perfecting of the kind of pleasure which he needs in his sickness, or of the ease which he then desires, not to perfect rest, to beds so soft that his limbs cannot ache upon them, or food that shall nourish with no demand upon the vital energy. He looks forward to change in his own capacities, whereby his enjoyment shall be made different. In being promised ease, he is promised health, to be able to find enjoyment, the true enjoyment of a man, in that which is pain to him. It may be intolerable and overwhelming pain, in exertion and endurance. He is to be delivered, by an increase or perfecting of his life, from pain, but by no means from all the things which he feels as painful. The only possible condition of true enjoyment is, that he shall find it in the things that to him are painful. His only true deliverance is in an added power. Now this thought, which sprang so naturally from our everyday experience, connected itself at once with the thoughts that have preceded. Is not man sick, falling short of his perfect life, and therefore feeling as pain that which is the rightful condition of his joy? It is true, mankind are subject to pains of body and mind, which oftentimes are overwhelming, utterly beyond endurance, which no effort, no philosophy can render otherwise than insupportable. The woes which surround human life may often seem as if they could not be exaggerated. They seem to admit no consolation, no alleviation. We cannot rejoice in them. We cannot rise above them. They penetrate our very hearts, and undermine the very sources of our strength. But though all this is true, though human misery is immense, it does not follow that the whole of it is not rightly the instrument and source of happiness. We see in bodily disease that our feeling certain things utterly and intolerably painful may arise not from the evil in the things themselves, but for want of a perfect life in us. They may be the very conditions of natural and healthful pleasure. And if we accept the thought of man as sick, does not the whole fact of human wretchedness, the heavy total of the pains of men, stand before us in this new light? Do we not receive a joyful gift, a perfect inversion of our thought respecting it? All pains may be summed up in this sacrifice, and sacrifice is, of course, the instrument of joy. To health, to life, it is so. If it is not so to us, what does it mean but that we are sick? Man's life, his true and proper life, his health, is of such grandeur, of such intensity and scope, that it would absorb, and turn into the servitors of its joy all that we now find intolerable pain, all agony and loss. Man's life is measured by his pains. It is such life, so large, so deep in consciousness, so rich in love, that in these sacrifices it can find its joy, its perfect satisfactions, its delights. These utter losses, and unfathomable miseries, and cruel strokes that leave us nothing, are its pleasurable efforts, its rejoicing gifts, its glad activities. So far short we fall, and so vast and glorious is the true human life. To apprehend it we must measure it by its pains, that is, by its capability of sacrifice. Man's being cast on that scale, planned to that magnitude, it claims that intensity, a scope and intensity that should make the uttermost evil and sacrifice to the self intolerable evils to us now, but as the healthful exercise, the hearty toil, that make the limbs throb with exuberance of life. So glorious is man's true being, so high we should elevate our hopes. The life we shall receive is such as would make all sacrifices joy, even those extremest ones from which we now shrink utterly. These things God hath prepared for those that love him. It is true that the height staggers our thought, and almost forbids our faith, yet why should we shrink from it? Are we not to be joined with Christ in his glory? And is any height of joy in sacrifice, of power to give and to be glad in giving, too great for him? And surely this thought of man's greatness is only like those new thoughts of greatness which the study of God's work everywhere enforces on us. Not less than immeasurably short of reality fall all our natural thoughts of the Creator's works, as in respect to nature, so also in respect to man. He too is unutterably greater than we believed, unutterably greater than we can conceive. But then God made him. How, therefore, can any thought be too high or glad? Man's perfect life could use all suffering for joy. That is, a love for others should be so powerful within us, and a consciousness of others' good should be so fully ours, such rapture should possess us, that all loss, all griefs, should be to us the trivial sacrifices which love delights to have the opportunity to make. That they are not so now reveals the condition of the sick man, who needs not ease or pleasure from without, but health within. The evil of our pains should make us say, not how evil is this that we are called upon to bear, but how far short we fall, man falls, of the true human life, that this sacrifice is an evil to us. It should prompt us to seek deliverance, but deliverance by cure, the deliverance that is brought by the perfected life, the joy that is the joy of love, and finds its necessary food in sacrifice. Any thought of happiness, any other anticipation or desire, any anticipation that puts aside the sacrifice, as if a sick man should desire, not restoration, not the power of enjoying effort and absorbing endurance into pleasure, but only soft and easy couches, rest and shaded light. This is to fall short in our desires, to make disease our measure, to demand a life that is not life, pleasures that are not truly pleasure. Must we not aspire higher? Must we not seek, desire, anticipate a happiness that is in giving, a life that is so wide and high and full that it can take up, nay, must take up, all that is utterest sacrifice to us, and make it the very condition of its rejoicing energy? A life to which it would be as impossible to use our poor self-pleasures, except for sacrifice, as it would be to health to lead the life of sickness. The whole thought is involved in the fact that devotedness and self-giving are the conditions of the joy of love, and that without love the life that love leads joyfully were full of pain. Man's perfect life is a life in which love can be perfect, and find no limitation. It is a life so truly lived in others, so participant with them, that utter and unbounded sacrifice is possible, the limitations of its mortal state bounding us no more. It is the life of heaven. But the thought need not be left vague. Do not the words of Scripture, which speak of the union into oneness of those who constitute the Church of Christ, supply to a definite basis? Are we not to share a life wider and deeper than we now seem to possess, a life coexistent with Christ's body, in the great joy of which all loss and sacrifice of self is swallowed up, the self remaining to us, indeed, only as purified and ennobled into the means of sacrifice? * If this idea should seem obscure, it may be sufficient to recall to our thoughts the representations given in Scripture of the Divine Being, as dwelling, and acting, and living in the creatures whom He regenerates. Is not this, then, the standard of human life ? Such life as would make all the bitter pains, the unutterable losses and overpowering agonies of man, the means of a glad service, the rejoicing offerings of love ? We must reckon, not the pains too great, but our life marred. It is not dark, but the brightness of a day that overwhelms our fevered eye. But make us whole, and joy will banish pain. End of chapter 5 of The Mystery of Pain. Recording by Ethan D. Gilkey.